Yes, so we'll also record the discussion. So if you don't want to appear on the video, feel free to turn your camera off. Thanks for doing the recording, Andreas. I'll just reintroduce myself. I'm Emily from the European Environmental Bureau, and I work together with the Real Research Project to advance their research finding on post-growth transformation and do policy advocacy at the EU level. So it's really great to see so many people interested in this webinar on credit guidance. So this is the second webinar as part of our Reclaiming Finance series. I'll put the link in the chat. We have another last webinar on the 11th of June with Dr. Elena Offerbeth, who's I think is in with us today as well, so that's great. And the first session was led by Professor Daniela Gabor on debunking de-risking and also presenting its alternatives. And today we are moving towards the solutions and really looking specifically at the role of central banks and the ECB in particular transformation of our economies. So this topic falls very nicely as a follow-up to an excellent event that was held last week by the New Economics Foundation on monetary fiscal policy coordination. So this sounds a bit like a mouthful, but this is why we have Charles today to kind of explain and debunk a bit more of what this is. And if you were not able to attend the event, I would also recommend you to have a look at Neff's report on the topic. I'll just put a link in the chat. So today, unfortunately, we were supposed to have a second speaker, but Christopher is unable to join, but we'll have Charles anyway. And we also have Colleen, who I'll introduce. She's not going to speak, but she's a co-author of the paper that the research that Charles will be presenting. And she's with us today. Hi, Colleen. And so she'll be there also for the Q&A discussion later. So that's great. So yeah, just a quick intro to Charles. Charles Stevenson is a doctoral activist scholar based at ICTA UAB University in Barcelona as part of the Real Research Project. Maybe Andres, you can also share a new LinkedIn page on the research project. So feel free to have a look at it and to follow it, because we'll post all new information on the project and events, etc. On there for now. So Charles' work focuses on formalizing the policies that constitute the core proposals for European social ecological transformation and to outline how European institutions would need to change to implement these policies. So yeah, we are really grateful to have him here today, given our work on towards the European institutions. Colleen Schneider is a researcher and PhD candidate at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. Her work focuses on political economy of monetary and fiscal policy and social ecological transformation. So yeah, really brilliant to have these researchers today with us. And I'll just give a bit of a structure to our discussion. So we'll start with Charles' presentation about, it will be about 15 minutes long, but we have plenty of time. And then we'll follow up with the Q&A with the remaining amount of time. And we'll aim to end around 11, so not later than that. And as I said, the webinar is recorded and we'll share all the materials and everything afterwards. So yeah, without further ado, over to you, Charles.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you to both you and Andreas for all your work organizing this series. I'm very grateful to be going before Elena and not after, but be sure to be here for the next one. It's exciting to me that so many of you decided to devote your time this morning to discussing a somewhat technical topic, but one which I believe could have momentous implications for the so far unrealized social ecological transition. I had a little intro, which I'm just going to skip, because today I'm going to talk to those of you who don't spend a large portion of your working lives thinking about the interplay between fiscal and monetary policy. If you're a macroeconomist, I would really love to be pushed on the finer details, but a lot of this will be quite familiar to you. I would invite all of you to interrupt me if something is unclear so that we can make this a productive hour for everyone. I'm going to talk about how credit guidance can turbocharge sustainability transitions. This is a topic, as Emily was saying, that I've been working on with colleagues Colleen Schneider and Christopher Olk. I know it's a cliche to say that anything you like is their work, but I truly owe them so much, so I'm saying it anyway. Colleen is here, despite 1,000 other commitments, so she'll be able to answer all your questions far more eloquently than I ever could. I'm going to kick us off with a question, which is, how can we stop this happening? This is an exclusive from the May 1st edition of the Manchester Guardian with regard to a report by the Leave It in the Ground initiative in the UK that found that commercial banks have pumped 75 billion pounds into so-called carbon bombs. These are fossil projects which fly in the face of the existing scientific consensus on climate. And this is a problem that we're all familiar with. And today we're going to talk a little bit about one step we could be taking to combat it. Before we get into that, though, I want to take just a little bit of a step back. As I say, I think we're all starting our day and talk about what our current approach to monetary policy is. And even before we do that, I want to talk about the difference between fiscal policy and monetary policy so that it's clear to everyone. So fiscal policy is everything to do with taxing and spending. It's normally the purview of national parliaments, the legislature, who pass a budget. So any policy package you might think about, I imagine many of us here would like to see some kind of Green New Deal implemented. This would fall under the rubric of fiscal policy. And monetary policy is a different kettle of fish. And I know that many of you work with this daily. So I'm actually going to pick on members of the audience. And I would like to know, like, what's monetary policy, who is responsible for it within the Eurozone, and what are the primary levers employed today? You didn't expect to be made to speak so quickly, did you? But I'm very comfortable with long silences.
Charles, do you want to pick on someone that you know?
I can't actually see everyone who's here. Is Dominic here? I might ruin his morning.
Theo or Dominic is here, yeah, I think.
Theo should,
yeah, Dominic is here as well.
Either of them. You both think about this more than I do. So tell us.
I'm at a train station, but I can answer. So you might hear a train go by. Anyway, yeah, for me, monetary policy, I guess. Well, I'll sort of answer your question reverse order. Tools-wise, I'd say it's like interest rate setting for financial markets, but using the central bank's power to sort of create money to set that. Also thinking about like asset purchases and the central bank's ability to buy up assets from financial markets, or also even the government, to stabilize different financial conditions. And then, who's doing it? You know, we've created a system of independent central banks, and in Europe, that is the ECB, but it's also then even more complicated because the ECB also has national central bank constituents, which also operate a bit independently. So, yeah, I don't know if Theo wants to add more as well.
Steve also said in the chat, is interest rate set by central bank? Yeah, feel free to add your response to the chat as well.
Okay, that's perfect. We can work with all this. Thank you so much, Dominic. Heroic contribution from the train station. Yes, exactly. So monetary policy is everything to do with governing the money supply in our economy. And as Dominic said, it's in the Eurozone, it's the purview of the European Central Bank, which governs the Euro system, in which the central banks of the various European member states actually carry out the day-to-day operations of monetary policy. And you mentioned kind of two primary tools. So the first was interest rate management, and the second is open market operations, which you might know as quantitative easing or QE. And these are kind of the two main tools that are conventionally employed today. Although QE is commonly thought of as unconventional monetary policy, because basically what it involves is the central bank buying a bunch of stuff from kind of rich people and institutional investors in the hope of boosting economic activity. The idea being that these investors would then reinvest the money in the economy and kind of get things moving again. And this is happening at tremendous scales. We're talking about hundreds of billions, if not trillions of euros. So the assets that they're conventionally purchasing are often government bonds, but also corporate bonds. And these will be of like the largest corporations active in the European economy, which are often heavily implicated in the fossil economy. So you can already see that this is a pretty skewed process. But I'd like to go back to interest rate management, which is really the primary lever of monetary policy. So if you're currently living in the Eurozone, as we were saying, the control of the European Central Bank in Frankfurt over interest rates determines everything from the mortgage you get offered on a house to corporate investment across the EU. This is the main tool that's used to maintain price stability, and this is the ECB, the European Central Bank's primary mandate. We've all lived through an inflationary crisis over the past few years, so we know that the ECB has struggled to fulfill this mandate. Why is that? Well, in part, interest rate increases are an incredibly blunt instrument for fighting inflation. The idea is that the ECB makes borrowing more expensive, so households and firms are less likely to take out loans to start a company or expand. This reduces economic activity across the board, and the ECB's hope is that in doing so, it will eventually hit on what's causing inflation, some sector where too much demand is chasing too few goods. What you risk by reducing economic activity through interest rate increases is sending the whole economy into a recession, and this is something the ECB is still having to answer questions about today. In addition, because the ECB was curtailing investment throughout this inflationary crisis, firms aren't hiring new workers. So you're basically saying our approach to price stability is, yes, Emily.
No, I'm just wondering if the slides should be moving
No,
because they're not moving.
The slides are fine.
Okay,
because,
brilliant.
Yeah. It's just to give us a little bit of context.
Yeah.
Thanks. So as I was saying, like our current approach to price stability is basically to increase unemployment in Europe along with the associated social immiseration until we hit our target. And you can really see this in the statements of Isabel Schnabel, for example, from 2022. They're quite striking. Finally, since its creation, the ECB has been overly focused on demand-side inflation. We'll talk about the definition I gave you, kind of too much demand chasing too few goods, and kind of the limits to that definition. So what do we mean when we say demand-side inflation? Well, very quickly, I'd like to cast our memories back to the 1970s, which, as you can all guess, I actually have no memory of. And there were a couple of energy crises, which sent the price of oil up. And because our economies run on oil, as still the case today, was the case in the 2020s, the price of oil affects the price of everything else. So in the 1970s, unlike today, there was strong collective bargaining power in the global north. So as prices rose, unions demanded and received higher pay, which in turn contributed to inflation, and so on and so on. And this is what's called a wage price spiral. It's demand-driven inflation, and its specter has haunted central bankers, including at the ECB, ever since. So when prices started going up during the COVID pandemic, the ECB thought, we know how to deal with these pesky workers, and they raised interest rates. Unfortunately, this was not a case of demand pull inflation. As Isabella Weber and colleagues have argued consistently, this episode was cost push inflation, in which increases in food and energy prices were compounded by price gouging by corporations, setting prices higher than they needed to be. In this context, central banks implementing interest rate hikes can actually make matters worse because it delays needed investment in the green transition, for example, which could have counteracted some of the pain stemming from the rising cost of fossil fuels. So, A, the ECB couldn't diagnose the problem, and B, they didn't have the right tools for a targeted response that might have achieved price stability months, if not years earlier. What is the alternative? My co-authors and I argue that the time has come to shift away from interest rate management and open market operations as the primary levers of monetary policy towards direct credit regulations. For our purposes, I'm using credit policy, credit guidance, and direct credit regulations somewhat interchangeably, but I imagine we'll get into some of the nuance in the Q&A. As a working definition, these are rules that determine what kinds of loans banks and other financial institutions can make. We distinguish between quantitative and qualitative credit regulations. Quantitative regulations set an overall ceiling for lending in the economy, and in this way, they control aggregate demand by limiting the number of loans that are being made out, again, to firms wanting to expand and to people wanting to build an extension on their house and this kind of thing. Qualitative credit regulations, by contrast, set conditions for loans or the activity being funded by the loan. I'll start with the latter set of regulations. You could imagine a limit on the amount of money that funds mergers and acquisitions, for example, as an activity, and this would curtail the shift towards oligopoly and monopoly control by various corporations in various sectors, and also thereby indirectly influence inflation. The one I really want to focus on are quality of sector regulations, because this is the policy which could, in one fell swoop, cut off the loans going from large commercial banks to the fossil fuel industry. This is the example that we started with. Remember the 75 billion pounds. If we had quality of sector regulations on what kind of loans banks are making, this is no longer happening. Finally, the quality of borrower regulations fulfill what's known as a macroprudential role. And the idea here is that if you think about the health of the firm, for example, receiving the loan, you can avoid the emergence of speculative bubbles and thereby contribute to the overall stability of the financial system. You're already getting a sense for the dual objective of credit guidance, which is first, to steer private investment away from damaging sectors towards those that need to grow, and second, to control aggregate demand and curtail inflationary pressures in a targeted sector-by-sector manner. Are we all on the same page here? Happy to stop if anyone's unclear. Great. As a very quick aside, every time I attend one of these events, someone says that fossil fuels are going to get outcompeted by renewables because the price of renewables has dropped below that of fossil fuel alternatives. There was an allusion to this in the event last week that you mentioned, Emily, but it wasn't quite clear to me whether it was critical or not. I just wanted to flag that we live in an economy in which investment is determined based on predicted profitability, and fossil fuels remain highly profitable, more profitable than wind and solar equivalents, for reasons that are explored with rigor and clarity in Brett Christopher's book, The Price is Wrong: Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet. Bottom line, as we saw in the first slide, investment in oil and natural gas is not just constant, it's actually increasing. So is this already happening? Are we seeing renewables outcompete fossil fuels? No. The investment we are seeing in renewable energy is coming on top of constant and actually increasing investment in fossil energy. Back to our credit guidance, our credit controls. Where has this policy actually been implemented? Because as we've discussed, in the Eurozone, we've had a shift away from these kinds of measures towards, again, interest rate management and open market operations. So anyone who's really interested in the history and how this worked before the emergence of the euro and the European Central Bank at the turn of the millennium, I really recommend the authoritative account of central banking in post-war France by Éric Menet. It's surprisingly readable. This is a period that's sometimes called the golden age of capitalism, despite the fact that it was dependent on continued immiseration in the global south. In Europe, we did see stunning increases in living standards following World War II, And these advances coincided with a market economy in which the state used a heavy hand to determine what got financed through credit policy. And in France, there was a priority towards manufacturing and exports. We often associate these policies with the word dirigisme, an economy directed away from what's hurting us towards what we actually need. Similar credit controls were used around the world and are still in place today, from Brazil to Indonesia. And again, Colleen can tell you much more about this in the Q&A. I wanted to flag that in China, credit policy remains the primary monetary policy tool. Whatever else we might say about the Chinese economy, these policies have contributed to truly remarkable development. You know how every 18 months or so, someone like Paul Krugman or The Economist will predict a recession in China? Well, the People's Bank of China's use of credit guidance is a big part of the reason that this doesn't happen, because they're able to redirect risky investments at speed and at scale, with the most recent example being real estate, for example. I want to go one step further and argue for the power of credit policy as a non-fiscal pay-for. What do I mean by this? So it's not controversial to say that a transition to sustainability requires massive investment. Colleen and I would argue that much of this investment is unlikely to come from private capital because it's required in sectors that are fundamentally unprofitable: public transport, care, nature restoration, you name it. And this is like one of the real limits of the current Green Deal. So if we go back to kind of a policy like the Green New Deal in some iteration, this would cause inflationary pressures because of the social components, which would increase the incomes of kind of low and middle income earners who are most likely to go out and spend their money. So we're going to see increases in aggregate demand linked to all this, let's call it social ecological investment. And we need to think of a way of offsetting this investment. We know that politically, doing this through taxation is difficult. It's far more difficult to pass tax increases through Parliament than it is to pass a spending package. I want to be very clear here. Both Colleen and I are clearly proponents of wealth taxes. We need to rewrite our tax code in favor of progressive taxation on wealth and resource use. But what we're saying is that in the short term, expansionary social ecological fiscal policy, call it whatever you want, could be offset by strict monetary policy, strict credit regulations on sectors that need to be phased out, with fossil capital just being one example. So the way this would work is that we would increase aggregate demand through our investment in social ecological transformation, and this expansionary fiscal policy would be offset by curtailing aggregate demand in these sectors that we are shrinking out of existence. And this is a perfect example of fiscal monetary coordination, which I can't see you all, but I imagine many of you were thinking about on last Thursday afternoon. And this is why we would refer to credit guidance as a non-fiscal pay-for. This is a term that we get from Nathan Tankus in the United States, whose work I really recommend for those of you who don't know it. Why is credit policy so important for the green transition? First, we are not currently transitioning away from fossil fuels. We are adding to the mix. Second, we have no tools for phasing out fossil fuels at the speed required. How are our cap and trade schemes going? Where are all our carbon taxes? 3, credit guidance can be implemented immediately. Policy. The title's stupid, but it's kind of a nice intro for those of you who are getting into the topic, thinking about credit guidance as a tool in our fight against climate breakdown. Those of you who want to get into a little more deeply, there's a beautiful peer-reviewed journal article by Katie Kedward with her colleagues Daniela Gabor, who launched the series, and Josh Ryan Collins, cares about credit policy and limits to green central banking. And finally, I mentioned China as an example. I think the political economy is fascinating. There's a really interesting piece by Nathan Sperber at the Institut Rousseau in French called Une finance aux ordres, and you should just be able to translate it if you don't read French in your browser, or just email him. I think he's doing interesting work. which everyone references when we talk about controlling credit. One more time, our existing approach to monetary policy has failed on its own terms, which is price stability. We had three years with inflation above the ECB's targets. That's way more time than we can afford to be wasting in this critical decade. And this is not even to mention supporting the general economic objectives of the European Union, which is the ECB's central mandate, as we all know. Credit regulations are used around the world to direct production and reduce aggregate demand so as to maintain price stability. And for those of you who would counter that our monetary policy needs to be market neutral, well, let's think back to those open market operations that are actually propping up industries from aviation to the gambling sector. I'll end by citing Eric Menet and Jens van Kluster. Quote, in practice, the real question that central banks face is not whether to influence the allocation of credit or not, but rather how and to what extent allocative criteria are explicitly incorporated into the design of instruments. Thank you all so much, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Charles. Yeah, this was very informative, lots of material, probably lots of stuff to debunk as well. So yeah, feel free to ask a question or raise your hand. We already had, I think, a question from Jasper. Actually, 2 questions. So maybe if you want to raise your hand and then we can take those questions. And also, if there's anything to clarify, feel free to ask, because I know there's quite a lot of macroeconomic lingo there, and some colleagues might not be familiar with it all.
And did I fail, Emily? Emily told me to make this accessible.
No, you didn't. I think it's yeah, it's just always like you don't know to what extent you could always, I guess, debunk. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes, good morning. Yeah, I thank you for your presentation. Macroeconomics is not my daily work, so I'm learning. But I see, for me, like the Paris Agreement is like an invoice for the last 100 years, create all the damage by the big companies, the big investors, the big institutes, etc., the big banks, everything. There are a lot of people getting rich about it the last 100 years. And I'm working in the climate field for the built environment, and I love the positive. We will create a better world tomorrow and today, and we will start, and we will have the intention to be positive. But we have also to have a look back last 100 years, who is getting rich of it. And the big oil companies, by example, they can't stop looking for new fields, by example. And now we need a court case to stop them. What's the role of court case in this kind of? Because I heard also we can have fields, oil fields, gas fields in the world, but we have also climate goals for a future-proof world, and we have stranded assets. You didn't talk about it, but it's like yeah, it sounds to me completely logical, but also difficult in this case, because oil and gas will not stop tomorrow, and also not next week. But looking for new fields, it's the other way. What's a good balance in this case?
Yeah, Jasper, thank you so much for that question. This is not to say that credit guidance is a magic bullet, which is going to phase out the fossil fuel industry. And there's clearly a huge role to be played by the legal system. This is just kind of one tool among others. And I obviously can't give you a balance of what's needed, but in general, we need to find ways to mobilize a mass public around these questions. And I would focus there on the social benefits that come from an ecological transition, and that's why we were laughing with Emily before we started about how we're not going to build a mass movement around credit guidance. This is a tool that should be in our arsenal, but we need to be talking about the policies that are going to transform people's lives and speaking to their lived reality in a cost of living crisis in Europe.
Thanks, Charles. We have two questions. So maybe Richard, you want to go first, or we also have Seb asking a question. And in the chat, you can see Thomas from the European Youth Forum asking whether this sounds like a great solution, but wondering if you could tell us a bit more why the ECB hasn't implemented yet, and if there are any plans to do so. So more in the terms of advocacy activities around pushing for credit guidance. So maybe we could take those two questions. So maybe, first, Richard, do you want to ask a question, and then we take Thomas' question, and then Seb's question later on.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Charles. Really good presentation, also really clear. So my question would be, when we refer to credit guidance, we often refer to China, which is quite effective in doing that, which, however, has kind of a different institutional setup, or we refer to historical examples like France. But then there's also the example that also Daniela discussed of, the tilting experiment in Europe in 2022 and 2023. And my question here would be, what can we learn from both the success? Because it was possible within the current institutional setup of the European Union, it was possible, but then it also failed rather quickly. So what can we learn from this success and failure for intervention strategies?
Mm-hmm. Emily, did you say we're taking Seb's?
Yeah, we take those two, and then we take Seb's later. Yeah, if that's okay. Over to you, Charles.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. I was gonna pass to Colleen, actually. Colleen, if you wanted to say something about this, because you were actually working on the period that Richard was referring to. But if not, I can say something.
Well, so there's actually, I think, a relationship between Thomas's question and the question Richard posed, right? And I think I wouldn't call the ECB's green tilting phase a failure, right? It didn't stop because it wasn't redirecting capital in the way that was intended. It was ended rather because of, let's say, ideas around institutional legitimacy and what is appropriate for central banks to be doing or not doing. Phase, which is where this connects to Thomas's question, right? The proposal, our proposal is not novel. Other people, so why isn't the ECB? A lot of what the ECB ends up doing, or central banks in general, comes down to institutional legitimacy, right? Institutions, and in many cases that sort of maintaining the status quo is the safest way to maintain that legitimacy, right? Factors in central bank general held after rate hike, not because they thought this was the most somehow effective way to actually deal with these inflationary pressures, but because that's what they were action. So how do we challenge that? How do we change that? Part of our broader project of monetary and fiscal coordination is also politicizing monetary policy, right? So this, part of it is right, understanding that monetary policy is necessary political. Central banking is always. I don't know, Charles, if you want to.
Yeah, thanks Emily and Charles for the presentation. It's really useful. I guess there's one question I have, and then a question that Dom's written to me in a chat, and I'll try to explain his question. And the first one, I guess, is kind of building on what was just said about political legitimacy. One of the things, we spoke to someone pretty senior in the ECB, and he was basically making the case that there's a limit to how much the central bank can do until governments are more serious about acting also, and that there needs to be kind of the same level of ambition across fiscal policy and monetary policy if we were really to tackle things in the way that we're suggesting. And so maybe you can talk a bit more about kind of what your ideas are to try to create that political legitimacy. Our argument, as you know from our paper at NEF about monetary fiscal coordination, makes the case that being more explicit and creating more institutions to be intentional about how we coordinate monetary fiscal coordination with more outside advice about where coordination is useful and where this coordination is happening and needs to be changed, would allow for more kind of political legitimacy for the central bank to support government policy and for governments to intervene when there is inflation. So I wonder whether you could talk a bit more about kind of the institutional setup so that more political legitimacy can be found, so that the central bank can be doing things like credit guidance and credit controls. And then the second question that Dom has sent me in the chat is about kind of, if, for example, the EU were to implement credit controls without capital controls, would this encourage capital to move abroad where their credit wasn't controlled? And does this mean credit controls proposals need to come hand in hand with capital controls? Or are there any other ideas that you have to make sure that capital doesn't flee in a scenario where we do credit controls? Thank you very much for the presentation, for this space.
Thanks, Seb. And I'm going to read Jeremy's question as well. So that's already 2 questions, but we have then a third one. But I think that, that's something that you talk about in your work already, Charles, is how this policy can be implemented in the current EU legal framework. And do we need a reform of the EU treaties or sensitive directives? And then we'll take later on a last round of questions.
Brilliant. So maybe we'll start with Jeremy's. We're excited about this policy. As I'm saying, as others have argued, we could begin implementing credit policy without altering EU treaties. Over the longer term, I think there's a solid case for doing just that. But again, we need to build political momentum for these changes. And that leads us to kind of Seb's question on credit coordination, and we fully support the call that also NEF has made for some kind of what we call a credit coordination council, which would increase democratic legitimacy of the ECB. This is the theory. This is again something, for those of you who aren't familiar, that is mirrored on the French experience. So in France, they had what was called the Conseil National du Crédit, which brought together stakeholders from across the economy, and together they informed monetary policy, and they informed the way finance was allocated across the economy. And we feel that there's still a place, a desperate, and I've lost my thought, but Colin, go ahead. Say maybe how our proposal for CCC differs from the one that was put forward by the NEF report, or
there's a bit around what the government do vis-a-vis the ECB and be within the treaty guidelines, right? So mandating certain forms of credit policy would contravene those guidelines, but there is space for oversight and accountability. And then I think this is the way that imagine the role of some form of credit council. It's this coordinating mechanism holding ECB accountable.
Mhm.
Maybe Charles, you might be better.
Yeah, absolutely. So the main proposal for like a European Credit Council is a deliberative body, so it doesn't actually have executive power over the ECB, and it's just seen as a way of increasing democratic legitimacy. So you have this kind of public debate about how we're implementing monetary policy. This is used by ECB to inform what they actually implement, and we feel that over the long term, this could go a little bit further from kind of, as Leah Downey says, from deliberation to power. So this the ECB like a branch of government, the way it is in China, as Richard was saying. But you could imagine a setup that's more ambitious than just a deliberative body that we currently see to decision making and to democratic legitimacy of the ECB. For those of you who don't think about this a lot, the ECB was really created as like the archetypal independent central bank following the Bundesbank, and kind of like order liberalism more broadly in Germany. And I think the limits to that policy in the face of, I forget exactly how Katie and Daniela put it, but kind of catastrophic concomitant risks linked to ecological breakdown, just as one example. Seb, we haven't talked about your point about capital controls. For me, they go hand in hand, and this is again what we see in China. But it's something we've been going back. Colleen, so did you want to add something there, Colleen?
No, I think this is an important discussion to be having. So would it even work to have credit regulations in the EU without capital controls, right? And there's some capacity that the EU has that's certainly greater than other nations with smaller economies. You know, the size and scale of the EU economy means there's going to be some more impetus for capital to stay within the EU. But it would certainly still with the capital play. Monet has written about like segmented domestic markets that are a result of credit regulations being another strategy to keep the capital within, in this case, a supranational market instead of capital controls. But I mean, I think for them to really be as effective, for credit regulations to really be effective as they could be, they would need to be complemented by capital controls, like we see in China, as Charles said. But that's an even deeper political battle, perhaps.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this ties up nicely with the question from Steve on basically the political will to move this forward. So yeah, how to convince people, where do we start? Because I guess, yeah, we are all pretty convinced that we need to move into that direction, but maybe in the more political strategy, how do we take this on board? And Jasper, you have another question? You want to ask it now?
Yes, we talk a lot about financial and economical, but is it also thinkable that we take into account other values, like social or ecological? They can say we have planetary boundaries. If we want to keep everything within planetary boundaries, and we talk about it and we report about it, and etc., but also financially, that we say if we put a price on it, what are the planetary boundaries in this case with other values than only money and economical?
Mm-hmm. Can I say something here? Because I think, yeah, those two questions really fit together. And I wanted to reiterate what I was saying to your previous question, Jasper, which is that the conversation we're currently having is very policy orientated. It's very wonkish, and it's not one that most people are really going to be able to relate to, given that I'm not even sure how many of us know kind of how the European monetary system is organized. So these are tools that at some point we're going to need to have, and we're going to need to have sympathetic central bankers at the ECB who are ready to support rather than to fight a green transition as their policies currently do. In order to actually achieve that green transition, we need to be building mass support for transformational policy. And again, the way that like Colleen and I, I think we all are on the same page here, but the way to do that is to connect to people in their lived reality, in a cost of living crisis in Europe, struggling to pay their bills, struggling with increased prices, struggling with terrible jobs. And so I don't think that we should start trying to build mass support around credit policy. It's too abstract. And Colleen and I have a paper coming out in soon, we hope, in which we talk about fiscal monetary coordination in more detail. And so we combine these ideas with transformative fiscal policies. And I think these are the ideas that are more likely to connect with people. So one of them that we talk about is a job guarantee. Let's end involuntary unemployment. Let's give everyone who wants a job, and let's use it to transform not just our economies, as you were saying, Jasper, but also our societies. Let's actually fund public services and make them accessible to everyone. So these ideas, as Colleen says, are not new, but that are not really part of the debate when it comes to a lot of these transition questions, and we think they need to be if we're actually going to build mass broad-based support for them.
Fantastic. Thanks, Charles. Anything you want to add to this, Colleen?
No, that was great.
Okay. Maybe I'll use my facilitation hat to ask a question as well, and maybe bring us back a bit to the more technical discussion, because I know that the ECB also holds trillion of member state government debt and also some bonds from the European Investment Bank. So I'm wondering how we can ensure as well that this debt is channeled into public economies. Is that something you touch upon as well in your work?
Yes, should I answer something to that? I spent a week in Maastricht with Dirk Ens, who's also now in Brussels, thinking about the actual mechanism behind kind of, I guess, the European monetary system and behind public spending in the EU. And you're absolutely right, Emily, that the amount of public debt held by the ECB is staggering. I think in the paper we cite that over the first year of the pandemic alone, the ECB bought 70% of public bonds issued in the Eurozone. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about open market operations or quantitative. So the Treasury of a member state issues a bond, it gets bought by some kind of then resold, and at some point the European Central Bank buys it up, and this basically guarantees the bond, and it avoids that we get a debt crisis as we did in Greece in the 2010s. And so to your point, Emily, like how do we ensure that this is actually going towards what matters? Well, that's again a fiscal policy question. That's actually like what's in our actual budgets. What are we productive capacity of our economy towards? These are the questions that we need to be asking. We need to stop asking kind of how are we going to pay for it, because as long as the ECB is backing up that debt, then we're going to be able to pay for it. The bigger question is, what are we paying for? Are we paying to rearm Europe in the face of perceived threats, or are we actually going to get serious about kind of the social and ecological crises that we're facing in the 21st century?
We also still are saying, like, we need massive investment, and there's a lot of question of where do we find the money? So if we want to build a campaign around that and rally civil society voices around this idea to just make them aware that no, this money is there, it's just the allocation problem, the issue, and the political will, obviously. Is there any? Yeah, Theo, please go ahead with your question.
Hi everyone, good morning, and thanks so much for the presentation. It was brilliant. So I have a question which is kind of part political and part technical, which is, I think, as you were alluding to, it seems like this kind of more ambitious central bank policy does rely on a groundswell of popular support for the green transition in general, allowing the kind of political space for a kind of technocratic actor to do something like this. and also then political support and more consensus around environmental goals. And then my question is kind of, once you got to that stage anyway, why do you need a central bank to do kind of credit controls on fossil fuels? Couldn't you just ban them through regulatory policy or that type of thing? So it's a bit like, what is it about the position of the central bank that allows it to intervene in these kind of markets in the credit process that you couldn't just do via fiscal policy and regulatory policy once you already had that democratic kind of support?
Should I start, Colleen, and you can jump in. Great question, Theo. It's really nice to put a face to a name. Yeah, we just think this is a better approach to monetary policy. It's far more nimble. So you're right that maybe the most direct way of countering inflationary pressures is to anticipate them. And then we're talking about fiscal policy, right? You design a budget and you identify inflationary pressure points in the economy, and you make sure that you counteract anything expansionary with something that's going to reduce aggregate demand on a fiscal policy front. But when it comes to controlling aggregate demand, we really think that the way we're currently doing it with interest rate hikes is just inherently limited. And the brilliance of credit policy is that you can do this on a sector by sector in a sector by sector way. And to your point of like, why not just ban fossil fuels? Well, there are sectors that we still rely on that need to be phased out kind of in an orderly way. And we feel that credit policy is a really effective tool for doing this, without necessarily having to national the whole sector. Again, we're not against nationalization, but we do feel that there's a role for more nimble credit policy and more nimble monetary policy in general in this process. Anything else?
Yeah, the question points to an important limitation that I think is highlighting, right? If you want to eliminate the sector entirely, like fossil fuels, credit regulations can't do that, right? So those are putting those private credit, etc. Now, so if you really want to eliminate the sector, this also then has to be complemented by direct regulation. But just as Charles said, that still like they have been shown and are used as effective tools to steer private investment, right? To steer the banking monetary circuit, and they can be very effective in that way, and yeah, can be more subtle and redirecting. Like Charles highlighted, the limiting mergers and acquisition credit for mergers and acquisitions, and the way this can be oriented, right, on sectors, on activities, on firms. Exactly, I'm sure repeating now what Charles said, right? They're a nimble tool, yeah, but I think they necessarily need to be by a broader forms of regulation. Regulations don't want to entirely take out the sector. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Hope that answers your question, Theo. Yeah, we'll just take maybe a last one from Jasper again, and then maybe close the talk, if that's okay.
What can we learn about the first week of the pandemic? We can switch off the whole world if we want. I was completely surprised, but it's also hopeful that if you really want, we can do. And there was no any political program. We have a lot of money available suddenly somewhere from, and I was to save the economy, save companies, save jobs. I was completely surprised about this. It was the first time in my life I see something, but also hopeful that if we really want, we can do it. We can switch off the whole world. It was, what can we learn from it? We are now back on business. We fly more than ever, etc., etc. We learn the hard way.
Colleen, do you want the final word? This seems like a good chance for you to cite David Graeber. I know I've heard you do that before.
No, I feel like you should close, Charles. Go for it.
No, please. It's perfect. Wow, muted. Well, I'm gonna do it for her. Colleen likes to say that the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it's something we make and could ultimately make differently. And I think we should take this seriously in monetary policy and in other fields. And yeah, I just want to thank everyone for your question. It's been really fun. It felt just like a kind of a living room chat, and we would all really love to hear your perspectives. So we are going to try to publish this article to get the full details, but already a lot of you work much more closely than the ECB than Colleen and I do. So we'd like to hear your thoughts, be it capital controls, be it whatever else. So I'm just going to write my email address in the chat here for anyone who doesn't have it, and I can put you in touch with Colleen if you need. But please do get in touch. Oh, it's Gmail. I think that's clear. Don't try sending emails to Gmail. But we'd love to hear from you all. And thank you again, Andreas and Emily, for your work.
No, thank you so much. So yeah, thank you, Charles and Colleen. It was amazing. I think we can all agree that this was super clear. And thank you also for putting your email address. I'll share the recording with everyone in an email and put your email address so that everyone can be in touch, and hopefully we can continue that discussion and move towards policy advocacy at EU level. So yeah, thank you everyone, and have a great rest of your day, and remember to follow the Reels Project LinkedIn's page that Andres kindly put back in the chat for any events that we're gonna organize, any paper that comes out from the project. And also sign up for the next event of our series. The next one will be with Elena Offerbeth, and that should be a really nice follow-up to the discussion today. So yeah, hope to see you there soon. Take care. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you all.
Thanks so much.